think we are assembled. I don't see everyone, but I'm assuming we're all here, or those of us who want to be here are here, and those of us trying to get in will get in. I'm Linda Eleanor. I'm so happy to see all of you, panelists, and the few non-panelists I can see. This is a two-day climate and dialogue series that we've never tried before. This is a total experiment where we're going to be modeling what we're calling Bohm-inspired dialogue to you participants out there. You're going to be watching for how this conversation differs from other kinds of conversations. I want to take, because of this recent shooting in Texas, which I know we're all just reeling from, I'd like to take just the next 30 seconds of silence and just send your prayers, whatever you can do. We'll just set for 30 seconds, let other people arrive, just be thinking about this horrible, horrible tragedy. Okay, thank you. Well, just a little bit about how the Climate Dialogue Group began. I'd like to recognize who I can. There were in the beginning about three of us who came together just through mutual acquaintances. John, our moderator, if you'll raise your hand, John, he's going to be showing us in just a little bit the difference between dialogue and discussion. Anna Factor, I'm not sure we can see her on the screen. And there was a man, Rick Lathrop, and we would meet every week. And just we started to resonate to this question of how dialogue might just bring more leverage to the climate conversation. We've been talking about climate, we've known about the climate emergency for decades, and yet the needle really hasn't been moved very much. So we kept talking about that, and someone introduced us to Richard Heinberg. Richard, you might want to wave your hand. He is a thought expert on the topic of energy, had just written this book called Power, Limits and Prospects for Human Survival, which just floored us. And it seemed to cement the idea that dialogue could play a very big role in the climate emergency, because it does develop what he calls horizontal power as opposed to vertical power, which we probably as a society know we have too much of. And then we got Fielding involved, and that brought us Rich Applebaum. Rich is up there on the top, and it brought us to David Blake Willis. He's up there at the top too. Thank you. There's a few more of us out there, I'm sure. Rick Moody, who's going to probably be coming in a little bit later. He's going to be behind the scenes helping us. Peter Whitehouse is there with the tree doctor. So we started to plan to have a series of these conversations. And Fielding got very excited about helping us sponsor them. So I'm going to let David say a little bit more about Fielding's role in this, and I'll be back a little bit later to talk about the structure of the day. David, you're on.
Thank you so much, Linda. This is an extraordinary opportunity, I think, for all of us to learn deeply about issues of sustainability. I will be introducing our president, Katrina Rogers, now. I do want to emphasize that Fielding Graduate University has a deep, deep commitment to social and ecological justice. This is one of our key values, and I note the social and ecological justice here. Our wonderful president, Katrina Rogers, is a major force in pushing for ecological to be added to our values statement. This is perhaps 10 years back, that it's social and ecological justice for all. Katrina has a long and distinguished career in public policy, especially in issues of sustainability. She's also always been supportive of those pushing for sustainability. I note particularly here our grassroots initiative from about 10 years back in the Sustainability Working Group that was founded by Carol Castle, Julie Smedzik O'Brien, and myself and others. The Sustainability Working Group then became the Sustainability Advisory Council to the President, many of whose members are with us today. I'll also note our dear colleagues, Rich Applebaum, Fred Steyer, and Paul Stillman. With them, we authored a book on leadership for sustainability, which of course represents many of the positions we'll be discussing today. Katrina is currently studying environmental values among leaders that have responsibility for improving sustainability practices in their organizations. Leaders from the corporate, governmental, and nonprofit sectors. And I'm always amazed at the range of contacts that Katrina has. The purpose, of course, of this work is to understand how people's worldviews are brought to bear on the actualization of sustainability work. We are honored to have Katrina open our dialogue seminars here and then participate in the seminars today and tomorrow. Katrina.
Thank you, David, and thank you for acknowledging all of the people at Fielding, those that you've mentioned and many others that we don't have an opportunity to mention today, for all of us together collectively as a community, working through what does it mean to be a conscious agent in a troubled world, and in a world where we know that the ongoing environmental degradation is hurting not only the planet, but is hurting humanity. And how do we create the conditions? What is our personal agency in creating the conditions for sustainability? We use the word sustainability, but it is such a big blanket umbrella concept for so many things. And I like to think of it as something that doesn't really need a specific definition. Sometimes we get so caught up in what is the meaning of a thing, but rather to think about it as an encompassing concept for the work that we want to try to do in the world, that what is our piece of that work. I wanted to tell a little bit of a personal story, which is that when I was in graduate school, I remember being struck over and over again. I began to read some of the scholars, both in environmental history, and that took me into more of a policy realm. But I think about the early historians in the 60s and 70s and 80s, even before that, they were writing on the relationship between human society and the natural world, and the conditions by which the natural world gave rise to certain human conditions and vice versa. And so they were digging deeper into those interrelationships. And this was happening not just in the United States, but with scholars in other places. And remember reading the work of Don Worcester and William Cronin and Alfred Crosby. Some of you who have been in the field a long time, you know these names. Carolyn Merchant, who wrote a lot about ecofeminism. These were some of my early ways that I began to access the importance of environmental work, and also really understanding those interrelationships, like the complexity of the untangling of things is just so important. And so I moved from that arena, more from that historical perspective, into policy, because it seemed to me that policy is where you're going to get change. And you think about some of the things that we have crafted internationally that have improved conditions. I know one of the ones that's often credited is the 1987 Montreal Protocol about the protection of the ozone layer. That was an early win, but what you can do when you brought influential people together from nation states and tried to work on an environmental solution. I also had the opportunity very early on to work with Thomas Homer Dixon's work on environmental conflict. And some of you, I worked with him. He is at the University of Toronto at a center there. And some of you may know his work, but he was really one of the first, he and his team, of course, nobody does anything alone, to really think about what are the preconditions or the relationships between environmental degradation and violent conflict. And this story is now repeated. You know, once you start seeing those frameworks and those factors, that story is repeated all the way to the present day. The ways in which drought, for instance, creates the conditions for climate conflict. And if you look ahead to the 21st century and what's happening as these decades unfold, as I'm sure many of you feel like this is a dark story, right? That we're in a very difficult moment in human history and in the history of the planet. And yet I think we are, and we also aren't, because at the same time, you can also look to see so many positive things that are happening as well. So today, the next 2 days will be really about delving into that, to the shadow and the joy, the light and the dark that we may be feeling a little buffeted by what's happening in our own society. And I really see all of these things as connected. And I want to, before I turn the mic back over, because we'll have so much more opportunity to speak, I want to just talk about a little bit about my work. David was right in saying that I began to focus on worldviews and how worldviews contribute to the actualization, self-actualization, which then contributes to action towards sustainability. And really, I came to that from fielding. I spent time in the academy. I left the academy to work directly in nonprofit conservation for a decade. And then I came back to fielding because I was looking for a scholar, practitioner community where I felt like there was this connection, that people were intentional about connecting scholarly ideas and research to practice, and also circling back from practice and incorporating that into scholarship. And I found it here, and I've been here for 17 years now. I find that over time, this is probably developmentally, but it's also the influence of you as fielding community members on the importance of adult development, the importance of the connection between our individual selves and our collective self, if you will. So I had been at this policy level, and then for many years at a community level, taking action for good, and then in an educational sphere. But what is really the mechanism of change? And it comes down to that individual. And I want to credit Lenny Wildflower. She and I together have done some presentations. I saw her. There you are, Lenny. I saw, we've done some presentations, and we've been starting to connect to a group, and some of you know this group, called Spirit of Humanity. You can look it up, Spirit of Humanity Forum, that really works on, I suppose, from our languaging, use of self, but it's really about how you're healing the heart and healing the planet. Lenny and I hope to present a concept more deeply about that at the International Leadership Association in the fall. But what we're really trying to think about is, how do we link healing humanity individually and collectively to healing the planet? And what is the connection between our own healing and care for the planet? And actually digging deeper into understanding things like, what is the quality of peace, the love, compassion, the altruism that we need to cultivate within us in order to then extend that peace from the individual to the family, family to community, and community to the world. This is not a new concept. Thich Nhat Hanh and many, many other renowned spiritual teachers talk about this. But how do we then infuse that into our everyday actions and inspire the everyday actions of others? So I just want to leave you with that thought, that part of what our roles can be as conscious people in the universe is really just be a witness to allow ourselves to feel the feelings that we may have, to accept the situation, and to just keep examining what it is that we can do to create the kind of meaning that we need to create in order to help heal the planet. And I'll leave you with this one notion, which is, there are times when anybody who's doing this work can feel a certain kind of despair. And I take a lot of heart from something that Angela Davis said to this community in January when we hosted her. She's a very well-known civil rights activist, thinker, scholar, professor, Angela, when she said at the very end of her talk, she said, hope is a discipline. And I took from that hope is a discipline in the sense that it's a responsibility, and it is a gift to have hope, to cultivate hope, to advance that in the world. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn this back over to Linda. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share a little of my story, and I'm really looking forward to the days ahead.
Thank you, Katrina. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm so heartened that Fielding has taken an interest in our project. I think it's the perfect place for so many of the reasons you said. You know, dialogue itself comes out of a worldview that really does help us reconnect with the entire natural world, with each other. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. And we're trying to model it to a broader public here, which is what we're going to do today. We're going to have a panel actually model a different form of dialogue. John's going to go over what makes dialogue different. And then we're going to ask you in the breakout groups to actually experience it for yourself. We feel there's tens of thousands of climate organizations out there all doing really good work, but we feel that there's a need for greater alignment, greater shared meaning, which is really what dialogue is about. And it develops the worldview that Katrina, you were talking about. Out of that worldview, that new worldview that connects rather than separates, we can find the solutions we need. I'd also like to recognize who I did not recognize before, Nancy Glock-Grunite. She's going to be on our panel. She's a recent member of the Climate Dialogue Group. And at the end, we'll be talking to all of you about how, through this Climate Dialogue website that John and I have just recently put up, mainly John, we'll be able to stay in touch with each other. So if you connect up with people in your breakout groups, or you'd like to connect with other panel members, that'll start to be possible. And we're also going to be doing other dialogues, formal with Fielding, as well as some private dialogues, and you'll learn more about that later. We'll talk about that. One little piece of background, the chat function. Since dialogue is all about really paying close attention to what is said, we'd like you to use, participants and panel members for that matter, only use the chat if you have specific questions that you would like to possibly bring into the dialogue itself. We're not sure that there'll be time for that, but possibly there will be time. But for sure, those questions can go right into your breakout groups. So for a record of your questions, use the chat for that, but not for side conversations. Please try to pay attention to what's going on here. So the flow of the day will be, John will give us some background on dialogue. We will have an opening question. We'll do a debrief at the end. We'll have a little bit of a break before we go into breakout groups. And then there will be hosted, facilitated breakout groups for about an hour. And then we'll come back here at 2 o'clock to the full group, and we will see where we've been for the day. I think that's enough for now for me. So I'm going to hand it to John to say, what the heck is Bohm-inspired dialogue, and how is it different from other forms of discourse?
Thank you, Linda, and I'm excited to be here today with all of you and to experience this approach to dealing with the climate issues that we've all been discussing, and yet move into a concept of dialogue, Bohmian dialogue. Let me share my screen and go through a brief overview of how this is different from what we might have experienced in discussion. So first of all, Bohm dialogue yields shared meanings and new solutions by building on themes that emerge in the dialogue. The dichotomy here is our experience of discussion is often about advocating and maybe even debating, ping-ponging topics, often data-driven, frequently with the objective of winning. You know, how's my point of view really standing out versus dialogue, which is a different approach, deep listening to all views, seeking meaning across alignment, across differences in which all members win, where we win together. It's the framework here and the objective of Bohm dialogue is actually how we begin to think together and form those new ideas that can come out of unsuspected connections we might have. First of all, is suspending judgments. I'm going to go through these in some more detail, but suspending judgments as we come in, leaving our guns at the door, leaving our points of view at the door so that we're able to take in what each other is saying. Identify assumptions. I'm hoping you can read that and with the sidebar. Identifying assumptions. Often assumptions are the deeper held views or beliefs that we might have Judgments might be the more immediate things that have caught our attention and we're focused on, but assumptions often guide how we respond. Bohm dialogue is centrally about listening, and listening at 4 levels. I'll explain that in a minute, but really deeply listening to each other. Often in discussion, we're formulating our response to the person who just talked. And so we aren't listening to them. Dialogue really it's important to be listening deeply to each other and find our own voice for the deeper understandings, as opposed to ripping off the top of our head the most recent arguments we've been in, the intellectual banter we've heard, and speaking to the center of the circle. This will be essentially a virtual circle of the panelists. And rather than interactive discourse between members, speaking to the center takes on a different organic process. And so those are the key elements of Bohm dialogue as we listen and build on emerging themes. First of all, suspending judgment. Leaving your guns at the door, if you will, suspending judgment of others' opinions, and acknowledge your own positions that might be judged and how to put them aside so that we're able to really take in what is being said. Replace your certainty. We've spent our lives becoming certain, our careers and certainly our academic careers in becoming certain and even skeptical, but replace that certainty with curiosity. Go into this with the possibility that you might change your mind. Identify assumptions. Be willing to disclose those assumptions, values, and beliefs that might be behind your own judgments or statements. And if you're not clear on what possible assumptions are behind other statements, you might just say, help me understand the assumption that might be leading your thoughts. And so that we're clear and we're open about what our assumptions are. Listen and inquire at 4 levels. Principally is about listening to each other versus planning a response. Empty your brain of the need to respond and listen deeply. Also be listening to yourself. What are your own thoughts and feelings as you're listening to others? What are you noticing about yourself? Listen to the group and listen for those shared meanings. What is formulating? What is organically happening in this group as we're listening to each other? And also, Bohm dialogue is often about a slower pace and often with a pause between statements to allow us to listen to the silence. And often that resonance in the silence brings us new meaning in terms of what we're gaining from each other and with each other. Also finding your own voice as opposed to quoting what you've just read, learned, the prevailing statements and ideas. Trust that voice which seems to be called to speak, maybe without knowing what you're going to say. Speak as the spirit moves you. This is important that you notice that deeper voice, whether it's vulnerability, anxiety about this topic and what that central part in your whole body. It's the right brain more so than the data-driven left brain. And speak to the center of the imaginary circle. We're going to be in a container, if you will, a safe container, which I will be hosting. But speak to the center of that imaginary circle as opposed to crosstalk with other panelists. And if you need to ask clarifying questions, you might ask them to the circle as opposed to just putting each other on the spot. For the attendees, those who are not panelists, those are participants, in observing this process, notice the examples of how this process really differs from other discussion-based meetings that you might have had. Notice what new meanings have emerged for you, and we'll get to them whether as part of the end of this dialogue or in the breakout rooms. So that is that's the overview for dialogue. We're going to start off with, as we typically do in a dialogue process, with a check-in question. and everyone will have about 60 seconds. So it's going to be fairly brief, 60 seconds to answer that check-in question. Then we'll get into the full dialogue in which everyone will participate as they feel called. And then we'll have a checkout question at the end, asking you really what has moved through you in this dialogue. Let me just pause for a second. Is anyone got a pertinent question here, how this process and flow will go? And I'll assume it'll come up. You'll find that this is an organically developing process. Our concern is that, different from discussion about the many different ways of approaching climate crisis and climate action, there are tens of thousands of them already out there in siloed parallel action. And the question is, why aren't we moving forward together? And that's because most of those siloed dialogues, siloed action organizations are not talking to each other. So the Bohm dialogue process is how to exemplify how talking to each other, listening to each other deeply, and trying to find the shared meaning really does stand out. My role is a host, not facilitator. So I'm holding the container with you and asking all of you to hold that container too, and realize that all panelists need to be heard. And so limiting our comments to that one thought in the moment, or how we build on the comments that you just heard, and how we begin to recognize those themes developing. So I think we've covered the fundamentals, and I'm going to ask you in a moment a check-in question, and we'll start and go around a circle. I will ask one person to start, and if they will then pass it on to another person. And I'll give you the question, and then I'm going to ask for 30 seconds of just silence to let that resonate for you. And the question I have for you in this check-in, which is the first brief comments from each other, is what is most front of heart for you regarding this climate crisis that we're facing? Not the most thing you read most recently, or the project you're working on, but what's most front of heart. That's the question. I'm going to ask for 30 seconds of silence here to let that resonate, and then I'm going to lead off and pick one of you to start off. So we'll start with the 30 seconds of silence. What's most front of heart for you in this climate crisis? Okay, I realize that's not a long time to think deeply, but I want to start off, and I'm going to ask you to limit your initial thought to that one thought of what is most front of heart, as opposed to all of the things that are on your heart. And I'm going to ask you to start off just giving your name and your day job, what you're associated with, as opposed to all the things you've written, et cetera. So I'd like to start off with Katrina. And thank you for your introduction, Katrina. And so 60 seconds, that most front of heart thought, and then pass it on.
I feel so sad about all the animals that are dying, all the other species that are dying so that humanity can live, and all the things that we've done. It really weighs heavily on my heart. That's my front feeling. Thank you for asking that question. I'm going to go to Kay Hutchinson. Hi, Kay. It's good to see you here.
This will be of another panel member.
Oh, I'm sorry, Richard.
Another panelist.
Yeah, my dear, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, John. Yeah, Richard. I'm sorry. I'll go to Richard.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, with regard to climate change, front of heart for me is a sense of dread and despair that if we were going to avoid altogether what's coming, we would have had to have started a long time ago, at least 2 or 3 decades ago. And the political and economic pressures have been so enormous, pushing us in the direction of a status quo. And those pressures are still there. No doubt there are lots of things we can and should do at this point. And at the same time, I think it's important for us to prepare ourselves for a very, very challenging time ahead. And for those of us who are present here who are younger, I would just say on behalf of my generation, I think we failed, and I'm sorry. And that comes with a sense of responsibility to do everything we can from this point on to shift direction and to make the response to the things that are now inevitable a response that makes sense and that salvages as much of nature and humanity as possible.
Thank you, Richard. And I might mention Richard represents the Post-Carbon Institute, where he's a fellow there at the Post-Carbon Institute. Who are you going to pass it on to, Richard?
I'll pass it on to Tatiana.
60 seconds of your what's most front of heart, Tatiana.
So as I currently work in coaching and healing capacity, supporting people in their deep emotional trauma, ancestral trauma, intergenerational trauma, I found that I'm recognizing in the other crises and modalities of crisis that we see outside of us, including ecological crisis, I recognize the same manifestations of trauma, and I find this inseparable. And the question becomes, how do we heal? And is our collective healing possible? Because I don't see that we can heal the crisis outside without healing the crisis inside. So this is my introduction, and let me pass this to Richard Applebaum.
Thank you, Tatiana. You're muted, Richard. Richard muted. Rich, you're muted.
What is on my heart right now is not directly on the environmental crisis, but the death of 19 children, elementary school children. I just can't get beyond that. And I guess the link would be the violence we do to each other and to our planet. And sometimes just feeling hopeless about it. It seems so pervasive. I hope through this dialogue process, my mood can be lifted and we can come to some understanding, but right now my mood is very sad. I'll pass this to Allison.
And I might just say, Rich, that the dialogue process encompasses all that we're feeling. And so how the tragedies of daily life that we're experiencing interface with the climate crisis is certainly on the table. So thank you. Allison.
Try to follow the rule and just not plan anything I'm going to say, but just let the spirit, which is unlike me, as you know.
Allison.
I'll start by saying I'm feeling so sorry for the grief in the room. And I don't know what can be done about that, but my heart goes out to you. I certainly relate to Katrina's comment about the loss of other beings, other species, ecosystems. That hurts me a lot, and I need to try to push that back to remain optimistic about making some changes. But as Richard Heinberg alluded, so many changes need to be made at a high level, and I don't pretend to understand the motives that perpetuate decisions against climate healing. I also want to give credit to the people around the world who, in the face of those realizations, are working very locally and often in very, very dangerous spaces to, cart water to the water holes in Africa that have dried up for the large mammals, and find ways of saving some pangolins in breeding programs and so forth. It takes bravery. Lives are sometimes lost in the process.
Alice, thank you for that check-in, and we're going to get into the full dialogue just after this check-in. But this
Yes.
is 60-second check-in.
Sorry, I must have talked slowly. Thank you.
We've got an Alice and an Allison, and it was so Allison, over to you, Allison Davis White Eyes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think, what's on top for me is, as we talk about climate and climate change, is the urgency of this situation. I'm trying to remain hopeful. I think having dialogues like this are critical and important to developing a sense of hope so that we can move that hope to action and not just sit in sort of this theoretical space of talking about it. And I think right now what really stands out for me, and this ties in with what Rich Applebaum said about the shooting and the war in Ukraine and the way we have failed COVID policies right now, I'm very concerned about our own inner understanding of the sacredness of life. It almost seems like we're accepting mass death. And I am concerned about that sort of mindset. So I'm thinking Freud, Eros and Thanatos. And right now, I believe the world is seduced by Thanatos. And I think that is a concern when we talk about climate and what to do about climate change.
Well, thank you, Allison. Do you want to pass it on to another panel member?
David Blake Willis.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm feeling what you just shared with us about this acceptance of mass death and violence. We think about literally hundreds of millions of people who don't have enough food, who don't have enough water, clean water, who are laboring in extreme conditions. And where is the empathy? Where is the empathy for all of the forests, all of the creatures? Where is the empathy? And I'm hopeful that we're going to go to a different place here, but we need to move to at least small actions on our part, each of us in where we are. So the violence, it can be dealt with. We saw that with Mahatma Gandhi and others, but right now I'm hurting.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to go ahead and choose for you, pass this on to Lanil Henderson.
Thank you.
60 seconds on what's most front of heart, Lanil.
Okay. Oh, I thought it was 60 minutes. Anyway, thank you very much. I feel the criticality of this issue very deeply. And it's been going on for a long time. This is not 21st century. This goes deep into our histories as human beings. But I don't feel despair yet. I do think that my spirituality will not allow me to collapse into paralysis or despair. So my first thought is that this is like an emergency management disaster moment where you have to act to rescue as much as you possibly can and then debrief and talk later. So I think we're at that kind of moment now. We've got enough knowledge in the room and among us and our networks to begin acting in some specific ways and then debriefing on where we are with those actions. So we reverse the process. So I think if we can do more of that, we might get a little further.
Might just say for all others, Lanil is a professor at Fielding Graduate University and a doctor of the world. Pass it on to Jessica Alvarez.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jess. I'm Executive Director of Transition US. And like Richard Applebaum mentioned, what's really front of heart for me is sending my second grader off to school today and thinking about the loss of life of 19 children. And before that, 10 days, the loss of people in Buffalo. And again, as folks have already named, the violence in this country, the deep sickness, these signals that we need to heal, and we need to do it now. I'm angry. I am feeling a lot of grief. I've been fighting back tears all day. But I'm also grateful for every bit of action and recommitment to this work that people take together. So gratitude. I'll pass it back.
Thank you. Pass it on to Peter Whitehouse.
Hello, everybody. So Peter Whitehouse, geriatric neurologist, and today play my artistic role as Sylvanus, the tree doctor, as was mentioned, who ask human beings what we can learn about health from trees and forests. So I certainly resonate with those of you that have made reference to the fact that there are other living creatures that we need to have in our thoughts and our feelings. What's front of mind always is story, is narrative. The universe, after all, is made of stories, not just atoms. And I think this, to put the positive twist on all this tragedy, is we have an opportunity, as Thomas Berry said, to create a new story. I think, as David Bohm said, we need to change our consciousness and recognize that consciousness doesn't belong only to us. So for me, it's the excitement and possibility surrounding creating a new story of what it means to be a human being, and therefore what it means to be in civilization together. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to John.
Thank you, Peter, and passing it on to Nancy Glock-Greenwich.
Thank
60
you,
seconds, most front of heart, Nancy.
Thank you, Peter. Right now, in my heart is my gratitude for us being together today. My sense of the opening up in the world, breakdown allows breakthrough, that deeper connections, learning from nature, with nature, in shared healing, that can also transform our institutions. We haven't always lived this way. We don't yet have another way of living. That's the immediate challenge that's driving everything else. But if we look at what is emerging around the world in response to this challenge, as Paul Hawkins said, what if climate change is not happening to us, but for us? And I just have been in dialogue with people so centered in this. I'm feeling such a sense of miracle. And a book, if I may mention a book, Citizen, Why the Key to Fixing Everything is All of Us. I've started reading, just feels like a key in the lock that I had been looking for. And this together with us today is just this moment. I'm experiencing them everywhere I turn. Perhaps you are as well. The miracles of reconnection and emergent new stories.
Thank you, Nancy. Linda, are we complete with our circle? I know David Albert is a panelist, but I didn't know whether it was today or tomorrow. David, are you on today? Linda, maybe you can.
I'm on tomorrow.
Okay, good. Thank you all. Thank you for the panelists that have contributed.
Mark Bradley has his hand up, John.
Oh, okay. I can't see him, so thanks. Mark, please.
Thank you. What's front of mind for me is reducing my carbon footprint and what I can do on a daily basis to achieve that goal. I embrace a plant-based diet, and I advocate for other people to do the same thing and help to provide the resources necessary for people to have those choices.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And might just note that you are a member of the Sustainability Council, Fielding Sustainability Council as well. Thank you, all panelists. That's just our introduction, and now we'll get into the deeper thoughts and dialogue, and how do we find that shared meaning that brings us an alignment, and particularly can offer alignment maybe across the broad spectrum. So the question now to open the dialogue and recognizing that we've got a large panel, so it's about constraining our comments so that everybody has a chance to speak at least maybe twice, but just be conscious of that time frame, maybe 3 minutes each, something for the first round. But so here's the question, and given the tens of thousands of other initiatives, what are some of the critical opportunities for collaboration within the climate movement that occur to you? And I'll open the floor for whoever wants to raise their hand and can go first. Okay, Peter Whitehouse, you, and then Mark Spradley.
This is an essential question that we're facing in many organizations. I'm working with Bill McGibbon's new Third Act, activism for experienced adults. But I'm not going to answer the question at the level of organizational interactions, more at conceptual. So to me, we have to bring science and art together, something I'm trying to illustrate. We have to bring nature and culture together. We have to bring space and time together. We have to bring a whole lot of ideas, as Nancy said after me, that connect ourselves conceptually to think about the spaces that we exist in different ways. So I think it's a matter of making connections in the mind. At the same time, you're making connections between organizations. I would love, go back to my initial point, for scientists and artists to collaborate more on sending out these messages that we really need to change our consciousness.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Mark Spradley. Mark, you're muted, Mark.
Consumers, regulators, and investors are asking publicly traded companies to adopt sustainability standards. I believe we have to also make the same kind of effort to ask private companies to adopt sustainability standards, in the sense that there are more people employed in this country by privately held companies than publicly traded companies.
Thank you. And this is an opportunity for us to begin to find the thread that we can build on. How do we build on the thoughts of others that have spoken? I'm having Diane, I'm having a hard time seeing all of our panel at this point, but let me know who else's hand is raised.
Want us to raise our hands?
Yeah, thank you. Rich Applebaum. I couldn't see you.
I'll build on what Mark just said. I think the problem we have is business. I'll just say, in my view, it's capitalism, the way it operates at this moment anyhow. And so bringing businesses into the discussion is absolutely key. I tend to be skeptical about the ability to do that, but I do think it's important to find examples of businesses that have done well while doing good, if you catch my meaning. In the United States, some are privately owned companies, public benefit corporations. Patagonia is one example. H&M, a large clothing firm based in Sweden, talks the talk. How well they walk it, I don't know. I was once part of a conversation with the woman who's now the head of H&M. So I think we need to find some positive examples and get them out. But I also think we need legislation and action to bring pressure to make it happen. It's not going to happen by itself.
Thank you, Rich. Laniel Henderson. may be muted. I cannot see you, Linda.
Yes, he's muted. Lanil, you're muted.
I'm not muted anymore. Anyway, we need to connect non-white communities and indigenous communities to this discussion and exchange, not discussion, but dialogue. But because when we're addressing the conditions that we see in those communities, we're also addressing environmental conditions. They're some of the worst examples of human existence we can find. And I see this not only around the United States, but whether it's the favelas of South America or the townships of South Africa, I see the same things. The people who are at the lowest end of the society are in the worst environmental conditions. So if we came together to work on that, we would be reaching one of those points of convergence that John counseled us to focus on in the Bohm dialogue.
Thank you, Linda. Linda Eleanor.
I'm sorry, my computer died there before I got my check-in question, so I'll kind of combine that with what I'm hearing. I guess where I'm really sitting right at this moment is great frustration that we haven't had a chance to really focus in because of all of the distractions from the Ukraine war, from the pandemic, from the shootings. They just seem to come rapid fire. And of course, our press is owned by corporations, as Rich suggested. And so they're money-making organizations. So we don't even really ever get to concentrate on the real problem because we are in a climate crisis and breakdown is happening all around us, but we never really focus as a society on it. So I think that's why I'm glad just to be here and have this opportunity to talk with all of you. And I think we need to find the right people to bring together to bring more alignment to our actions. It's just that simple.
Thank you, Linda. I am not able to see the entire panel, so.
Tatiana has her hand raised.
Okay, Tatiana, please.
So what I'm hearing right now is about need to connect and make these connections within different organizations and leaders, some who are exemplary in their understanding of the urgency of the moment and may provide certain examples how they can do sustainable business and make these connections and relationships. But that, for me, is a macro level. However, we're dealing with individuals. Each of us are an individual with our story and our trauma story. And I'm just bringing a little bit from that field of trauma that is often unspoken, unaddressed, and unhealed. And I know how people respond or not respond, react when they are in crisis, when they are in pain. They don't connect, they disconnect. It's automatic trauma reaction. It's a brain physiological response. And we can talk a lot about connection on macro level, but if we don't look into the story of each person, including those leaders of those organizations, imagine one leader with unhealed trauma. If they are triggered, they can start a war. They can come up with some crazy ideas, some ideas that may hurt others. And they may not be aware that they are acting from a place of trauma. And people around them may not feel empowered to bring them to awareness that they're acting from the place of trauma. And people around them may be traumatized by this response and disconnect, and that trauma just builds up. It's like a pyramid. I don't want this to make this so dramatic, just wanted to bring this awareness. When we talk about this crisis and how to make connections, we need to take a systems approach and understand that there are different layers, different levels, macro and micro. And each of us have individual needs for healing and for awareness.
Thank you, Tatiana. And speaking as a native Ukrainian, I think we can greatly appreciate where your feelings are coming from, and yet they apply to all of us, don't they? And I think that was your message, but I'm sure all of us are feeling deeply for your home country.
John, David and Richard both had their hands up.
Okay, David.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, John. Want to appreciate, Tatiana, your position looking for healing from trauma. And I know you've worked closely with Thomas Hubel, who has done a great deal of that work. Of course, listening to those who have been caught in the crossfire, as it were, there's a great book which I was just introduced to a couple days ago about Ukraine, and really this is not new. And it's not new what's been happening in the United States with the mass killings and so on too. This is not new. The book that I wanted to mention is Bloodlands, and some of you may be familiar with the book. I'd also like to mention the idea of emergent strategy, what we need to do to look to the next steps, and particularly want to recommend a book by that title by Adrienne Marie Brown. I'll see, I don't know if I'm able to do a file transfer into the chat. If I am, I'm happy to share that, but just a few notes on Adrienne Marie Brown and emergent strategy, that this is about the relationship between small and large. We need to look at this in a systems sense, as Tatiana has mentioned too, how we change, intentional adaptation. So for example, as Mark was referring to earlier, eat less meat is a very big part of this. I think eat no meat is better, but I'm not going to push that too much. Interdependence and decentralization. We need to be aware of the interdependence and the decentralization that's gone on. So much is commodification now, and we need to look for non-linear and iterative pathways of change, as Adrienne Marie Brown says. Resilience, of course, creating more possibilities. And it begins in so many ways with us. It begins with us. So finding even ways we can be small examples for folks. I think Rich is next. Rich Applebaum.
Let me just confirm for the attendees, this first round is just for the panelists to enter into dialogue with each other. And we'll get to the attendees, those who are not panelists in the breakout sessions. But did you say, Diane, I cannot see all the panelists, so I can't see whose hand is being raised.
Richard Heinberg has been holding his hand.
Okay, thank you.
As has Allison.
Great, thank you for so many really deep and meaningful comments already. For me, the climate crisis is a crisis of power, and it really goes back to evolution, human evolution, and especially the last couple of 100 years that we've developed so much economic and social power as a result of using fossil fuels. The power of fossil fuels has, of course, gone largely into the hands of relatively few people, but it's an enormous amount of power that's changed how we live in really dramatic ways. Our population has gone from 1 billion to 8 billion. And so we tend to see this problem generally in one of two ways: as a social problem with so much power flooding into the human superorganism. Some of us are empowered over others because we already had these hierarchical structures for this power to flow into. And so the inequality, economic and other forms of social inequality between human beings has grown and become, onerous to the extreme. On the other hand, there's the biophysical aspect of power, where it's just the sheer force of 8 billion people consuming ever more every year and demanding that the economy continue to grow, to take up more of nature's space and push out more other species and extract more materials with every passing year. The only solution is going to come from confronting power. in all of its manifestations. Not that power is a bad thing, but currently we have too much of it, and it's too unequally concentrated and expressed. So what does that mean? It means those of us who tend to see the world through the social lens of unfairness and inequality, and those of us who see the world through the biophysical lens of natural limits, need to start talking to each other more. And that there are lots of implications for that would take a while to unpack. But I think that's one crucial area in which dialogue and understanding would lead to a lot of light and possible new ideas.
And that's central to what we're about here too, Richard. Thank you very much. Is about how do we initiate that deeper talking to each other and a deeper sharing. Allison.
Thank you. And Richard, I really liked your point about power. And I would add to that confronting power means we need to confront ourselves, because we are the ones who've constructed these systems and these power dynamics and hierarchies. You know, and thinking about this, I was sort of channeling some things Tatiana shared. It was very heartfelt and so very true that there's this macro and micro approach to confronting some of these challenges, and they're very, very important. And I really resonate with Tatiana's point about the inner work people have to do with their own trauma. And I'm kind of tying that into, you know, as we think about confronting climate change and what it is that we're going to do, I think it's going to take all of us collectively confronting our own worldview. And this is where some of what Lanil was saying about reaching out to various communities, and I'm sort of channeling this a little bit, but Indigenous communities who have this rooted knowledge in the various ecosystems where they live. And I think that what is critical about that rooted knowledge is that it is relational. It is about relationships beyond the human, that encompasses the planet as a living being. And by living being, I'm including things that in the English language, we consider inanimate, like rocks and the air and things of that nature. But everything is holistically tied together. And so this is going to take a tremendous shift. This is going to take us confronting the way we have imagined and constructed our idea of the world. And tying this a little bit to what Rich Applebaum said about capitalism being the problem, I'm wondering if part of that paradigm shift that we all need to undertake, this change in our worldview, needs to move us from a materialist perspective to a post-materialist perspective moving forward. And what would that look like?
Thank you. Thank you. And I think Jessica had her hand up next.
Yeah, I'm really resonating with what everyone has shared. And so that means I'm right where I need to be. And so my thoughts on collaboration are, what are we going to do to honor the power of our present moment? When we do gather in spaces like this, we're going to have beautiful dialogue, I'm sure. We'll begin a journey together where we'll get to understand our different orientations and different knowledge and experiences that we carry. But what are we going to do after a 2-day climate dialogue? That's what I think about, is really, again, honoring the relational and really, again, taking responsibility for these moments, because we do have power. The fact that we're able to gather in this way and talk conceptually about this tremendous challenge, let's use it. That's what I'm feeling right now.
Absolutely. And there's questions about whether dialogue is action. It is action. This is an action step. Peter Whitehouse, I think did you have your hand up? No?
I did. Well, I actually was thinking of putting my hand up. So well done, John.
Your face appeared on the screen. Let me go to Linda Eleanor, who did have her hand up, and we'll get back to you. So,
well, I was going to say something about actually Transition Town, and Justice spoke. She's part of Transition Town. That was where I first really got educated about what could be done. That made sense to me about climate, because I mean, we're already seeing the breakdown of civil society. Well, what are we going to do when that happens? We had better be prepared. So I'm beginning to think that some of the things that any of us can start to do is just to connect where we are locally, regionally, find out how decisions are being made where we are. Where are we going to get food, for instance, and fresh water should things break down? I mean, I think it was Bucky Fuller who said, if the system that you're in isn't working, then build another one so that you can rely on that. So I'm beginning, anyways, to really feel like that was where I got started with climate, and that's more or less where I think many of us should go. So that's one strategy, anyways. So I'm really glad that we can connect and reconnect with each other.
Yeah. Nancy,
Nancy.
Nancy, go ahead. Nancy, you're
Thank you
muted.
all. This has been so rich. I want to start with a very immediate practical answer to the question posed. There are some people in the climate movement whose climate work is to be connectors, to seek to connect each other. And they're committed to it, competent in it. So I think we can reach out to them as perhaps our next step in dialogue with them. The second thing goes the other way. I realized a few weeks ago that our whole species is suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. And our connection with nature, we were all of us at some point indigenous, meaning deeply rooted in relationship to the lands we lived on. And our history for the last several thousand years has been to be ripped off our lands stolen from us, and we stolen into labor, often elsewhere. And I've been there are a number of excellent processes of grief work, eco-grief work, emerging, for example, the Good Grief Network. And I think that part of our role in climate is to do that work ourselves, always in companionship with others. It has to be together, and invite others. I think the sense of powerlessness and overwhelm, it's not that people don't care. They're motivated, they are not enabled. They don't see, even if we confronted government and stopped what we're doing now, we don't yet know what else to do. And yet there are extraordinary answers emerging at all levels. The book I mentioned earlier is nothing but stories from all over the world of an emerging movement of bringing indigenous styles of dialogue and mutual problem solving at local levels typically, but not only, into governance, and governance serving the ends of life.
Thank you, Nancy. Who did I see? Lanil, did you have your hand up, or are you just on the screen? There you go. Over to you.
Very quick, I just want to call attention to some things that do work, are in the process of working, and that's the collaborative between the Chesapeake Bay Foundation here in this region, the Chickahominy tribe nation, the Urban League, and a group of farmers who are all coming together to sort of listen to each other and to learn from the wisdom of each other in trying to address aspects of climate change that are pertinent to them. And I think I'm coming back to Katrina's opening remarks. Writing those up and documenting those is a very important resource, because it's just my impression that when we have these, let's say, dialogues, there are certain people that we listen to and there are other people that we listen to less. We have to listen to everybody as fully as we can for these alliances and collaborations to actually bear fruit. And so I do think we have some working examples around the country of what could happen that we ought to pull together. And one of the places to start that is to have a dialogue with the foundations and the foundation world, because they're supposed to be funding things on the cutting edge of issues like climate change. And it'd be interesting to see collectively what they've learned from their various members that belong to the Council on Foundations that we might use as a resource, as Nancy was saying, to inform our subsequent actions. Because I think Jessica is absolutely right. The question is going to be sort of, when we step out of this dialogue today, what are we going to do next? Where are we going?
Exactly. And in the spirit of Bohm dialogue, David Bohm said that if a group can speak together in deep listening and begin to find shared meaning in the thread that's going through, eventually we can come to begin to think together. And out of that thinking together, there can become new solutions, new ideas. It's very encouraging what you've said about the people in Chesapeake Bay and Chickahominy. And we don't have a corner on dialogue. Dialogues can occur organically, and that's such a positive statement, Lanil. Rich Applebaum.
I've gone already. Do I get to go again, or?
Yeah, you do. You can. Not many more times, but.
I just want to build on Lanil's suggestion. So there are kind of two different discussions going on. One is, what can we do to save the planet, to roll back this juggernaut, to reverse the situation? That's a pretty big question. Another thing we can talk about is, how do we work with people who are affected by the change that is in process? And that's in many ways are local. So I'll just share with you briefly something I'm involved in. Just prior to this call, I was on an hour Zoom with a bunch of faculty members at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who work in this area. They study climate change, they look at sundowner winds, they look at fire, they look at floods, they look at disasters. And with a large group of people from the Santa Barbara community, including supervisors, including a group that represents undocumented workers. And I have a role there. I'm trying to pull together a group of academics who have the knowledge and people in the community who know what the needs are, and get them to talk to each other. It's called the Disaster Resilience Network. And it's really taking off pretty effectively. We had about 20 people on the call this morning. I'd like to reinforce what Lanil said. The people who are most affected by this are the most powerless and the poorest. And in our country, throughout the world, non-white people, bringing them into the dialogue and dealing with what they can do in terms of resilience. I'll just say one other thing. The state of California is putting a lot of money into resilience. They're not as interested in funding what can be done to stop climate change. They're sort of saying, this is a reality California is facing for this time. We'll put money into how do you respond to it? How do you develop resilient communities?
Great, thank you. Peter, you do have your hand up, and then Alice, I can't see you on the screen, but when I get to you.
Well, continuing to celebrate local activities, I just heard Michael Drake, the president of the University of California, launch their Center for Climate Health and Equity. And also heard about the master plan for aging in California. It's great how this great state is beginning to think about, you have to make connections between issues and whether it's about aging. I'm just going to add one other thing that and celebrate Gillian Williams, who's with us. I think of the many components that we need to bring together. And clearly, I think Allison did a great job of summarizing all the interconnectivity is intergenerational. So let me just bring that into the space particularly, because I started working as an activist with Extinction Rebellion and Sunset and got energized. And it was why I joined the Third Act was Bill McGibbon, of course, has a long history of action in this area. I'm not sure why he picked 60, but the idea that now we should develop these intergenerational connections, because as somebody said, maybe Richard, our generation has not done a great job. We are part of the creation of the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration. It's my grandkids. That's why I'm here in San Diego for many reasons, that we need to work with, think about, connect with, and return our own great interconnectivity with nature as part of that.
Yeah, and glad you mentioned Jillian. Jillian, I apologize we didn't call on you in the check-in. Difficulty seeing everybody who should be in the panel. But I want to welcome you in, and I know you've had history in both of these fields of dialogue and climate change, and so welcome your comments. And so would you like to add now?
Yeah.
You're muted, yeah.
Yes. Thank you for, oh, sorry. I know my internet connection was bad, but thank you so much for including me into this dialogue, especially with intergenerational voices, because just as Peter said, he hears a lot of voices coming from his generation, which I don't hear, but I hear voices coming from my generation. So it is very interesting having these conversations. And I think that also builds accountability into our dialogue as we're talking.
Thank you. Alice McGilvery, are you there? I can't see your.
Kind of left the screen.
I don't think she's here anymore.
Okay.
Tatiana has her hand up.
Tatiana, please.
I like very much this idea of connecting on the local level, building communities, because research and practice shows that healing happens on this level in communities. It's much easier to connect, establish this connecting practices, even like growing a garden together or restoring a land to its beautiful green state that it was before devastation happened. What happens when this healing is created? Something beautiful happens. People lose their addictions and attachments. And in these addictions, this is a vulnerability that is right now exploited by the current worldview and the power structure that fed from that worldview. And the whole marketing and selling industry is built on this vulnerability. And we are producing and selling a lot of stuff to people that sometimes or often is unnecessary, just advertised, and it's fed of that addiction and of that pain that people have inside, and addiction as a compulsive response or coping mechanism to soothe that pain. But when healing it happens in these communities, and people no longer depend on these things to feel in themselves to bring them back to wholeness, when they feel whole already in that community, they won't need that new gadget or that extra shirt or something else, that a lot of these things. And maybe through this grassroots, we can start shifting the worldview, because it seems that it's so difficult to shift the worldview from the top, from all the structures that already cemented it.
Linda?
That kind of goes back to that. Yeah, thank you. That really goes back, Tatiana, to what Richard Heinberg was saying in his book, Power, about horizontal power versus vertical power. I really think from just a regular person's point of view, we can't keep waiting for something to happen from on top, because as Richard has pointed out, both in his book and from other things he said, people at the top don't have the empathy, the kind of empathy that is needed to change the whole system. I mean, if I could wave my magic wand and be queen for a day, I would change the whole system. It's crazy. We are in a crazy system right now where we're still putting tons of carbon into the atmosphere. Our corporations are running everything, and they only are doing it for profit, not for the common good, right? So given that that's the environment that we have, then what can we do to change that from a horizontal power place? And I think you just said it beautifully. It's a combination of doing our own healing work, reaching out, establishing those bonds. And suddenly, if we're not needing all the stuff that we use for addictions and all of that, then suddenly we're not putting more money and more energy into the very system that's been hurting us.
Linda, I'd like to pull Richard Heinberg back in, and just you just mentioned the notion of horizontal power, and in your book, your thoughts, Richard.
Right. Well, horizontal social power comes in different flavors, different kinds. And the tools of social power, of course, have included things like weapons and money and communication technologies. And as we've developed more and more of those over time, especially since the origin of the early state societies, mostly in the Middle East, but then in China and various other places, social power has become more and more vertical, where a few people at the top can tell everybody else what to do. That's very different from the horizontal social power that existed in indigenous societies all around the world for thousands and thousands of years, where essentially there was very little economic inequality because people just shared whatever they had. They may have had very, very little in our terms, but they just shared what they had. Everyone was mutually endeavored, nobody indebted to everybody else. Nobody tried to keep track of how much or to whom, because it was understood that if everybody works together and shares, then the whole society benefits. Now, as social power has become more and more vertical over the last 7,000 years, and as the most vertically organized social societies have tended to take over everybody else, especially during the last 500 years, European takeover of basically the rest of the world, it puts us in a very perilous situation, because suddenly the sources of power that we have relied on we're becoming aware that they are physically limited. And what does that mean for the entire power structure? Unless we do something to change that power structure, what will happen is that the people at the top of that power structure will do anything, literally anything, to maintain their advantages. And the people at the bottom of that power structure will suffer the worst. And that could be very, very, very bad indeed. So when I say confronting power, that's what I'm talking about. And in many ways, that means confronting our own power, because all of us on this call are members of a society that is, if you look at the global spectrum of consumption, we're in the top 10%. I'm pretty sure every one of us on this call is in the top 10%. So part of the power that needs to be confronted is our own. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. Jessica.
Again, on this topic of power, which I'm really resonating with, I want to uplift and acknowledge the work of groups like the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, the New Economy Coalition. These are groups that are actively organizing to contest for power, and from this orientation of solidarity and shared struggle. So in building resilient communities, and I really want to appreciate Linda for mentioning kind of the deep learning from the Transition Network, where average folks take a look at what we already have access to. Our neighbors, for example, how many of our neighbors do we actually know? In California, we're in fire season. Do we have a disaster response plan in place? Do we have, a commitment to building that culture of care for one another? So within Transition, we're really taking a look at basic needs and really centering that in the conversation when we talk about climate resilience, and what can we do at a regional and local level to activate all of these different players and pieces of the puzzle that we have towards this new solution, towards the world that we all know that we need at this time.
Thank you.
It seems like there's two strategies going on. One that would say we need systems change, which needs to be at the top, but we know how blocked that is. But there are organizations out there like Extinction Rebellion that are working at that level. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think actually both that and what Jessica and Richard, you're talking about in terms of building horizontal power, I think they're both necessary. I think it was David Willis. You put me on a path of that book, Deep Adaptation, which I really appreciated because it's an edited book and it has so many good chapters on the psychological, emotional, and on just things ordinary people can do to build the horizontal power again. So I'm beginning to realize this movement, while it is siloed, and I think dialogue can help bring it together, I'm hoping, those seem to be the two basic paths. And we really do need to do them both, and they're all still about connecting and developing aligned strategies.
I just want to poll the group at this point and respond to what you're hearing amongst the group, what you're hearing for yourself as well, in terms of the shared meanings. Where are the threads that are appearing amongst this group in terms of meanings that we're beginning to share? And you see that thread beginning to connect us all. Interested in your observations of that. What are those themes? I mean, certainly one of the ones that I noticed is that Tatiana talked about is trauma, that we're facing trauma every day, not only yesterday, but I mean, almost on a daily basis. And how does that affect us in terms of how our collaboration or willingness to listen to each other? Jillian.
I've been hearing the fact that a lot of us in our places where we gather and like part of systems that we are, especially in work, we're very constrained and there is no space to bring in either the people or the other beings or the empathy that is needed. We're very constrained, and I think it's part of the reason we are also siloed in our personal lives.
They're not only, you know, as I hear this, and I see Linda, as I hear this, and I want to hear from all people, is that we can be siloed in terms of the different initiatives. We can also be siloed in terms of our ethnic initiatives as well. And I'm so grateful for Allison being here. So the indigenous view of life is so critical for us to embrace and have that voice in the discussion. And so, in the event.
John, Peter and Richard wanted to jump in. Richard Applebaum and Peter.
Applebaum. Okay, Richard. Good.
Oh, I hear a lot of convergence here. Sort of echo my own